Dead bodies don't trend. That is the grim reality that the Sudanese people have discovered as a seemingly never-ending war ravages their lands, shatters families, and threatens to tear Sudan, Africa's third largest country, in half. What began as a power struggle between two military leaders, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, alias Hemedti, has transformed into a relentless conflict that will leave deep wounds on the country's psyche. And yet, despite Sudan and her people bleeding, the war is barely a flicker in the global public consciousness. The media occasionally covers it, but only when the violence reaches a fever pitch, when the death toll spikes, or the nation teeters on the brink of famine. However, this coverage, quickly lost in the noise of the 24-hour news cycle, often misses several crucial points. 1. Why is this happening now? 2. Who are Hemedti and al-Burhan, and why are they fighting? And 3. How is it that such a vast nation can so suddenly implode? And that's the real problem, because buried beneath the sporadic headlines lies a war that, if left unchecked, could have major ripple effects for the entire world. Island of Inhumanity, the Siege of al-Fasher. In April 2025, the BBC did something many thought impossible. They smuggled phones into the besieged city of al-Fasher, capital of Sudan's North Darfur state. Under constant bombardment since the start of the war, al-Fasher had been largely cut off from the outside world, making it almost impossible for journalists or anyone else to get in. The timing would prove fortuitous in a grim way, as no sooner had the phones arrived than the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, led by Hemedti, launched a major attack against the city. The RSF had been aggressively trying to capture the city since the year began. In January this year, they launched 2 failed but brutal assaults that were repelled by the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, and their allies in the Darfur Joint Protection Force, a collective of former rebel factions originally formed in another of Sudan's wars, who were opposed to the RSF. So, what made the April offensive different? Well, first, this offensive was meant to capture the entirety of North Darfur, not just al-Fasher. Second, the RSF were reinforced by Colombian mercenaries, because although the world isn't paying much attention to this war, foreign powers still have their fingerprints all over it, quietly supplying arms, money, and fighters through back channels to keep the conflict alive. Third, they captured the Zamzam refugee camp 15 kilometers south of al-Fasher. While they had previously attacked the camp before, with devastating consequences for the refugees, this was the first time that they converted the camp into a military base from which to attack al-Fasher. And attack al-Fasher they absolutely would. In July, they stormed into the city, their first significant foray there since the siege began. The defenders of al-Fasher would retaliate with equal ferocity, prompting Mathilda Vu, advocacy manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council, to describe the city as a death trap. The July clashes were only the beginning of a grinding war of attrition. The RSF, confident in its momentum, pushed forward into August with increasing ferocity. On the 2nd, with the help of their allies in SPLM-N al-Hilu, they launched a 2-pronged attack on the city. Now we'll get into exactly who SPLM-N al-Hilu are in a later chapter. For now, we just say, it's a mouthful. For now, though, all you need to know is that they are allies of the RSF. The Abu Shouk refugee camp, located 2.5 kilometers away from al-Fasher, was their next target. On the 25th, they attacked it and controlled half the camp by the next morning. Sources told the Sudan Tribune that the RSF had looted homes, displaced residents, and abducted around 30 people. An RSF field commander told the Tribune his troops were planning to capture the Army's 6th Infantry Division headquarters in the city center. However, the RSF wasn't relying solely on firepower. They were reshaping the battlefield. Yale University's Humanitarian Research Lab, HRL, uncovered something chilling when it examined satellite imagery of al-Fasher in mid-2025. Since May, the RSF had constructed more than 31 kilometers of berms. These are earthen walls and raised banks encircling the city. According to the researchers, these berms suggested that the RSF was, and I'll quote here, creating a literal kill box around al-Fasher. This made escape for the 260,000 people trapped inside basically impossible. Horrifically, that may have kinda been the point. Since they swept across Darfur at the beginning of the war, the RSF have committed atrocities against civilians on a grand scale. Murdering, kidnapping, enslaving, and sexual torture have all become commonplace, as have massacres. In perhaps the most notorious mass killing at El Janina, it's thought that up to 15,000 may have died, almost twice the number killed at Srebrenica during the Bosnian War. The shocking part is that this isn't the only example of extreme inhumanity from Sudan's conflict. In al-Fasher, siege tactics have reduced starving people to eating animal feed. In the capital, Khartoum, detention centers have been uncovered where hundreds of people have been tortured to death. Entire cities have been sacked and burned. Agricultural land has been destroyed, and some 12 million have been driven to flee their homes. By May of 2024, US Special Envoy for Sudan, Tom Perriello, was already estimating that 150,000 people had been killed. By summer 2025, that estimate had risen to 400,000. That would make the Sudan War one of the bloodiest conflicts this decade, up there with the wars in Ukraine and Tigray in terms of body count. But while both sides do bear responsibility, with the SAF infamous for its indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, it's only the RSF that stands credibly accused of genocide. Only the RSF that is known to have carried out door-to-door ethnic massacres after it captures a city. At the time of writing, there are similar fears for al-Fasher. Because it takes a while for us to produce these longer videos, it's possible that the city will have actually fallen by the time you see this, in which case yet another atrocity will have likely been added to this conflict's long list. But while the battle for al-Fasher seems to be tipping ever so slowly into the RSF's direction, the rest of the conflict in autumn of 2025 appears to be in a strategic stalemate, according to regional analyst Alex Dewal. Writing for the BBC, Duvall believes that each side is staking its hope on a new offensive, a new delivery of weapons, a new political alliance. But neither can gain a decisive advantage. And that does raise a couple of terrifying questions. One, are we now doomed to witness Sudan's disintegration for the second time in 2 decades? And two, how the did we get here? From Janjaweed to RSF, the monster the state built. With the conflict seemingly in stalemate then, let's take a moment to step back and answer one of the most important questions. How do we get here? How do we get to the point where perhaps 400,000 Sudanese lie dead, where entire cities have been torched, and where one of Africa's largest countries seems to be on the cusp of collapsing into anarchy? The conventional answer would take us back to the 15th of April 2023, when the RSF attacked SAF bases across Sudan. However, war is rarely conventional. And if we only go back that far, we'll miss the undercurrents of tension that predated and predicted this conflict. So, let's take an even greater step back, to a time before the RSF was the RSF, to a time when they were simply called the Janjaweed. Now, to understand the roots of the Janjaweed, we need to look not to Sudan, but to its western neighbor Chad, a country ravaged by a protracted civil conflict. In 1980, Muammar Gaddafi, who you probably remember as the Botox-faced Libyan dictator ousted during the Arab Spring, intervened in this conflict to support his ally Gokoni O'Day, then president of Chad. Gaddafi sent his soldiers into Chad, and to aid them, he armed Arab nomads in the country's east, right next to Sudan. Now, by this point, in its war-torn post-colonial history, Sudan was extremely au fait with just how troublesome armed insurgents could be. To act as a deterrent against the forces in Chad, Khartoum armed Arabic-speaking nomads from the Rizakat and Misriya tribes. These two groups, despite the different motives in their formation, would form the backbone of the Janjaweed, which loosely translates as devils on horseback. Both the Rizakat and Misriya belong to the greater Baggara Arabs fraternity of Darfur and Chad, a group that had once been the lords of the desert, controlling vital trade routes. But by the post-colonial era, their influence had waned, replaced by the emergence of elites centered around Sudan's Nile Valley. The resentment this created towards Khartoum would be one of the key drivers in the RSF's evolution, although the route there would not be simple, running through decades of war and eventual genocide. In 1987, the belligerents in Chad reached a peace deal that stopped Libyan involvement in the conflict. But because this is Africa in the 1980s we're talking about here, there was no way Chad could settle down without Sudan simultaneously exploding. Sporadic fighting between the country's mostly Christian and animist south and the Muslim north had escalated into a full-blown rebellion in 1983. The renewed fighting in Sudan gave the Arab militias ample room to grow, and Khartoum often turned to them as a supplemental force to aid in the fight against the Sudan People's Liberation Army, or SPLA. And yes, that is yet another acronym in a video that is absolutely full of them. And get used to it, because as with many of our deep dives episodes, we're about to meet a whole lot of militias going by a whole lot of extremely similar 3 or 4 letter names. Brilliant, isn't it? Now, the SPLA was founded with the goal of re-establishing an autonomous southern Sudan. But while their whole thing was about liberating the country's south, they also identified as a movement for all oppressed Sudanese citizens. We want to emphasize the word oppressed here, because oppression is an oft-cited reason for groups in Sudan to fight against the central government. The tribes in the periphery generally feel disconnected from Khartoum and the decisions made by the capital's elites. It's a feeling that has persisted to this day, especially in the West, a region whose relationship with the central state has long been shaped by structural marginalization. According to Alex Duval, in a report for the World Peace Foundation, Darfur is the poorest region in the country. To illustrate, he pointed to Darfur's healthcare system, which has lagged far behind the rest of Sudan since independence. At the time, the region had only 3 hospitals and fewer than 6 beds per 100,000 people. This wasn't just the lowest ratio in the country, it was well below the levels found in Khartoum and elsewhere. While other parts of Sudan slowly expanded their medical infrastructure, Darfur never caught up. By the turn of the millennium, it trailed every other state in key metrics on child survival, nutrition, and basic health services. This neglect wasn't accidental. The government's chief economic minds had made it clear that Khartoum was focused on the so-called Hemedti Triangle. This is a loosely defined area typically understood to mean the commercial farms and towns within a day's drive of Khartoum. Named after former finance minister Abdulrahim Hamdi, the triangle was the focus of much of the country's investment. Hamdi argued that by itself, this triangle was an economically viable microstate. By focusing on it, the government could ensure prosperity without having to worry about the areas far from Khartoum, like Darfur and southern Sudan, which Hamdi viewed as a labor source for the triangle. The Darfur War, the war in which the Janjaweed cemented their place in Sudanese history, was sparked by this feeling of oppression, specifically allegations from non-Arab tribes that they were victims of an intensifying apartheid campaign from the Arab-led Khartoum government. It was an accusation echoed by prominent international legal experts, including Professor Alan Dershowitz and the former Canadian Minister of Justice, Irwin Cotler. According to Julie Flint and Alex Duval in a report for the UN Secretary-General, the anger at Khartoum reached a boiling point in July of 2001 when 2 non-Arab tribes, the Zakawa and Fur, swore oaths to defend their territory. It would be from this pact that one of the decade's most notorious wars was born. Now, before we get to that, we probably need to take a moment to address the gun-toting elephant in the room. When talking about ethnic divisions in Sudan, terms like Arab and Black often get thrown around, as well as reference to Islamists. But that doesn't mean the divisions map onto anything that we'd recognize in the West. Drop down onto a random street in America, all sides in the conflict would be considered Black, while the vast majority of them are also practicing Muslims. But no, in Sudan, the divisions have more to do with cultural identity, history, and entrenched hierarchies of power than with skin color alone. The distinctions between those who identified as Arab and those who identified as Black emerged after centuries of Arab migration, intermarriage, and the slave trade. To be an Arab in Sudan means speaking Arabic, practicing Islam, and embracing Arab customs. This cultural identification became a ladder of social prestige, especially as northern elites distanced themselves from indigenous African practices that they viewed as backward and ignorant. And 2 of the groups that they looked down on the most were the Zakawa and the Fur, whose defense pact was about to shift to an offensive arrangement. Things kicked off when the rebels successfully attacked the army on the 25th of February 2002. The rebels continued attacking government installations, targeting police stations, army outposts, military convoys. The SAF retaliated with an air campaign against rebel strongholds in the Mara Mountains, but while their bombing campaign was effective, the government's ground forces, inexperienced in desert combat, were struggling to deal with the rebels. And this became abundantly clear when 2 insurgent groups, the Justice and Equality Movement, or GEM, and the Sudan Liberation Army, SLA, attacked the Sudanese airbase at Fasher in April 2003. Once the dust settled there, the Sudanese government could assess the scale of the defeat, and it was staggering. Several expensive pieces of military equipment, including Antonov bombers, were destroyed, and the commander of the airbase, a major general, one of the highest ranks in Sudan's military, had been captured. The rebels killed 75 while only losing 9. Flint and Duvall, in the book Darfur, A Short History of a Long War, would describe this victory as an unprecedented humiliation for the Sudanese army. Despite decades of armed rebellion, no insurgents had ever dealt Khartoum such a psychological blow, and they took full advantage, winning battle after battle. On the back foot, the government shifted to a three-pronged strategy: military intelligence, the Air Force, and deploying Arab militias, collectively known as the Janjaweed, as the main force to fight the insurgents. The decision to use the Janjaweed was not unanimous. According to Flint and Duvall's book, General Ibrahim Suleiman, former army chief of staff and the then governor of Darfur, warned against it. He believed that, and we'll quote here, a racially based mobilization would have terrible repercussions on intertribal relations for the next several decades. End quote. It wouldn't take several decades for the general to be proven absolutely right. It was only going to take months. While fighting the insurgents, the Janjaweed conducted what international observers, including Human Rights Watch, described as an ethnic cleansing of the tribes involved in the insurgency, with then US Secretary of State Colin Powell describing the Janjaweed's campaign as genocide. These condemnations, however, rang hollow, as they weren't accompanied by any meaningful action. In fact, it was the opposite. According to the New York Times, when asked what the Sudanese government could do to resolve the Janjaweed issue, Powell rather blithely replied, "Since they turned it on, they can turn it off." During this period, the Janjaweed was led by Musa Hilal, chief of the Mohammed, a branch of the Rizaqat ethnic group. He collaborated with Sudan's then president Omar al-Bashir to formalize the Janjaweed into a paramilitary force called the Border Intelligence Unit. And remember Musa's name, he is going to become rather important later on. And it was within this brutal formalized militia that a new leader would emerge, a man who would eventually eclipse his own commanders. His name was Mohammed Dagalo, but you and me and the rest of the world would come to know him by the nickname Hemedti on account of his baby-faced looks, Hemedti being an affectionate nickname meaning Little Muhammad. And it would be Hemedti who would take that paramilitary force, suborned to the elites in Khartoum, and turn it into a vehicle for conquest. Just a quick pause to share something with you that we are rather excited about over here. No, we're not asking for donations to fund our counter lawsuit against Somalia yet. Also probably won't be necessary. Instead, we want to tell you how WarFronts has expanded into a brand new medium. Fronts.co. It's a website. It's not a .com because that was unavailable, and even if available, really expensive. This was expensive enough. So, after launching our newsletter earlier this year, we realized there is an appetite out there for our brand of analysis in the written form. So, we got in touch with some experts, including actual award-winning journalists who agreed to write for us. I know. They did, though. They did. WarFronts grew so fast. And now we're showing you the results. Fronts.co is our subscriber-only website featuring longer-form, in-depth articles on aspects of defense and geopolitics that we feel are getting overlooked. The inner mechanics of Russia's sanctions evasion, how maths can make you a better warfighter. Yes, really. And if you want serious analysis for dangerous times, this Fronts.co, that site, is the place to be. Beyond that, it's also going to be the home of exclusive videos. Twice a week, we'll be publishing bonus WarFronts episodes covering everything we do best, like assessing whether Poland or Russia would win were war to break out tomorrow. All of this is just $5 a month or $50 a year. That's fronts.co, not .com, and nothing on WarFronts is changing. All of the content you love remains here as ever. It's all just extra. And now back to today's video. The Rise of Hemedti. Credible information on Hemedti's early years is hard to come by. However, according to most sources, he is descended from the head of a sub-clan of the Rizaqat ethnic group. He allegedly dropped out of school in the 3rd grade, became a camel herder, and only took up arms in the Darfur conflict when men attacked his trade convoy, killing 60 members of his extended family. Despite having little formal education, he quickly rose up the ranks of the Janjaweed, capturing the attention of President al-Bashir. Hemedti's abilities would impress al-Bashir so much that the latter would appoint him his de facto enforcer, leaning on him to fight in Darfur and wherever else the regime needed an enemy crushed. Al-Bashir was so reliant on Hemedti that at one point, according to the World Peace Foundation, or WPF, he referred to him as Hamyati, my protector. In a sign of how close their relationship was, Bashir allowed Hemedti to hold onto the gold mines of Darfur's Jebel Amar mountain range, Sudan's single largest source of export revenues, after the latter had captured it from rebels. The relationship wasn't always rosy, though. In a portent of things to come, Hemedti led a Janjaweed mutiny against the government in 2007. According to the WPF, he led his forces into the bush, promising to fight Khartoum, and I quote here, until Judgment Day. His troops shot down an army helicopter as Hemedti negotiated with the militias in Darfur and threatened to storm Niala, the capital of South Darfur, where, in 2025, 18 years later, he would announce the formation of a parallel government. Hemedti eventually cut a deal with Khartoum, ending the rebellion. In exchange, the government would pay his troops unpaid salaries and offer compensation to the wounded and the families of the dead. Hemedti in turn secured a promotion to the rank of general and a significant cash payment for himself. A documentary shot during this time enshrined Hemedti's cult-like presence among the Sudanese people. It showed him as more than just a military leader, but as a charming master negotiator capable of deftly handling parallel negotiations with the Darfur rebels and his own government, while still showing deep concern for his troops. Recruiting both Arabs and non-Arabs in his forces further endeared him to the public. This was at a time when the divisions between Sudan's groups was at their most pronounced. After making peace with the government, Hemedti's troops were folded into the border guards, headed by Musa Hilal. Hemedti, however, quickly became a rival to his commander and soon received his own legion. And yeah, now it's time to introduce one of the two big players in Sudan's current war, the Rapid Support Forces. The RSF was initially constituted to fight the Sudan People's Liberation Army North, or SPLAN, an armed group whose remnants are still fighting in Sudan's Nuba Mountains to this day. Despite early missteps against the SPLAN, the RSF learned crucial lessons that would serve them well in future fights, most notably the 2015 defeat of the GEM in al-Nakara and Gozdango. 2015 would also mark the RSF's first international excursion. After the March 2015 Saudi Emirati military intervention in Yemen, Taha al-Hussein, Bashar's chief of staff, made an agreement with Riyadh to deploy Sudanese troops. The operation would be led by, among others, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, a name some of you will already remember from the introduction. For those in need of a bit of a refresher, he today is the leader of the SAF. In other words, the guys Hemedti's RSF are currently fighting against. And speaking of the RSF, the troops used in Yemen were mostly RSF fighters loyal to Hemedti. And from a military standpoint, they did a good job. The Sudanese forces were instrumental to the creation of a buffer zone in the north of Yemen along the Saudi border, and the capture of Hajar Governorate and Midi Port, which most experts believe was a Houthi supply port. By 2017, Hemedti was in control of not only Sudan's gold mines, but also some of the best equipped and trained armed groups in the country. Al-Bashir would further reward him by passing a law that legitimized the RSF as an independent security force. By doing this, Al-Bashir was borrowing straight from the How to Be a Dictator for Dummies book, specifically the chapter on divide and rule. By elevating Hemedti, he was deliberately creating a parallel power center to counterbalance the regular army. Al-Bashir was betting that if the army ever attempted a coup, the RSF would help secure his rule, a sentence we're just going to leave dangling there for just a moment, just to emphasize a little of what we in the business call dramatic irony. We told Hemedti's story to illustrate an important point about the man at the helm of the RSF. He has unlimited ambition, and his ultimate goal is to rule all of Sudan. It's an ambition he may be fulfilling. Under his watch, the RSF has evolved from a ragtag militia to an organized armed force, and most recently into a parallel government, one that now threatens to split the whole of Sudan in two. 2019, the revolution that didn't finish the job. While Hemedti was nursing his ambition, Sudan was diving headfirst into a crisis. We've briefly touched on Omar al-Bashir, but only in the context of the Janjaweed and RSF. What we haven't told you is that al-Bashir had ruled Sudan since 1989, when he led a coup against the elected Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi. His rule faced stiff opposition from the public and other political parties for what they viewed as heinous human rights violations and oppressive Islamist policies. The public routinely protested, and some military figures attempted coups, but these were crushed under al-Bashir's iron fist. One protest, though, running from 2011 to 2013, almost brought Sudan to its knees. The story of South Sudan's fight against Khartoum has kind of gotten lost in the narrative of Hemedti's rise, but the key point is that after decades of conflict, the South won the right for a referendum on independence and in July of 2011 finally split off to become the world's youngest nation. Of course, this being a former part of Sudan, things were nowhere near as smooth as the international community had hoped, and soon the new country was embroiled in its own civil war. But the key part for today's story is that South Sudan's independence meant Khartoum lost access to a large number of oil fields. The result was a sudden collapse in Sudan's income, runaway inflation, and a severe lack of dollars to cover essential imports. The cost of living absolutely skyrocketed. And to address the economic crisis, the Sudanese government announced several unpopular austerity measures. Taxes were raised, civil servants were laid off, the price of fuel increased, and people hit the streets in the thousands. What started as anti-austerity protests quickly escalated into demands for al-Bashir's resignation, encapsulated by the phrase, Ashab yurid iskat an-nizam. The people want to bring down the regime. Khartoum responded with batons, tear gas, and live bullets, effectively quashing the protests. But while Bashir could beat the protesters into compliance, he couldn't just get his goons to thwack the economic fundamentals with a large stick and make the bad numbers go away. And as the line ticked ever further downwards, that meant Bashir being forced to take more and more measures guaranteed to keep the flame of anger not just alive, but itself royally pissed. In 2018, Khartoum had eliminated several subsidies which immediately doubled the price of bread across the country. Fatima Ahmed, a local housewife, perfectly captured the country's reaction to this price increase in an interview with Reuters. Quote, "The new prices will make us starve to death. The government doesn't care about us. Our conditions are harsh. We won't be able to endure more." And it wasn't just bread. Khartoum had devalued the Sudanese pound, which led to wildly fluctuating exchange rates and reduced the amount of hard cash that people could access. Long lines for basic commodities became a common sight throughout the country. These would eventually become more than just a symbol of scarcity and empty bellies. They became incubators of frustration so great that it would eventually bring down the regime. Now, the first spark emerged in al-Burhan in December 2018, and within days, the fire spread to Port Sudan, Dongola, and finally into Khartoum. The government initially tortured protesters into admitting that they were members of the Sudan Liberation Movement, or SLM. The choice of the SLM over the dozens of armed groups that have ravaged Sudan was meant to convince the general public that there was a racial element to the protests. If this worked, it would deflate all support for the protests. These forced confessions, though, did little to douse the public's anger. As many dictators have only found out at the last moment, people aren't stupid, and treating your starving masses as equally manipulated dum-dums can be an extremely efficient way of making the transition from dictator to overthrown tyrant. And so we enter the dying days of the al-Bashir regime, one that had lasted 30 long years. In 2019, the dictator declared a year-long state of emergency, dissolved the central and regional governments, and replaced regional leaders with military officers. He also appointed Mohamed Tahir Ayala as Prime Minister and Defense Minister General Awad Ibn Auf as First Vice President. As a final act of defiance, he banned unauthorized demonstrations, a move that, predictably, only led to even more demonstrations. On the 6th of April, the Sudanese Professionals Association, or SPA, called for a march to the Armed Forces headquarters, which was answered by hundreds of thousands, some of whom brought mattresses. The sheer scale of the turnout dwarfed the protests of 2011. This wasn't a few pissed-off people trying to complain. This was a tidal wave of ill feeling, all about to come crashing down on one man. To be fair to them, Bashir's National Intelligence and Security Service did their best, firing live rounds at the protesters, but then the army allowed the demonstrators into its HQ before opening fire on the NISS. And with that, the countdown to the end of the dictatorship had officially begun. The timer reached zero on Thursday, the 11th of April 2019. That day, General Awad Ibn Auf announced that al-Bashir had moved to a safe place following the regime's collapse. In that same breath, he also announced that he would be at the helm of a military-led transitional government. Finally, he imposed a 3-month state of emergency, suspended Sudan's 2005 constitution, and closed the nation's airspace for 24 hours. For the protesters, this was a little like learning that your arsehole boss has been fired, but his replacement would be his equally arsehole-y identical twin brother. To say that they went nuts is to do a disservice to bar snacks. Amid rising public anger, Ibn Auf resigned, choosing the army's inspector general as his successor. And it's here that the other major player in Sudan's current war makes his appearance. Because, as you probably guessed, that inspector general was none other than Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. At the time, though, the protesters were jubilant. After all, it's not as if al-Burhan seemed like the sort of guy who might soon plunge their nation into an apocalyptic war. So if that's the case, then who exactly was he? Despite not being a cult-like figure like Hemedti, al-Burhan had built a name for himself within the army as a competent officer across a decades-long career. The protesters liked him because he was one of the military leaders who reached out to them during the sit-in. Additionally, and we have to stress this was a really big deal among Sudanese military men at the time, he hadn't been implicated in any war crimes and wasn't wanted by international courts. Which is a plus. And with that, al-Burhan went from well-respected but relatively unknown military man to the guy at the helm of Sudan, basically overnight. Amid the chaos of the revolution, though, al-Burhan wasn't the only one who was rising. Weeks before al-Bashir's ouster, Hemedti had endeared himself to the public by refusing an order from the president to shoot the protesters. Then when the endgame came, the RSF, which, remember, had been elevated by al-Bashir precisely so it could protect him from a military coup, had stepped aside and allowed the generals to do their thing. This, alongside the RSF's strength, earned Hemedti a place in the country's Transitional Military Council, or TMC, as al-Burhan's number 2. However, according to Ishan Tharoor, foreign affairs columnist for The Washington Post, Hemedti was the TMC's de facto leader. The days following al-Burhan's ascension were marked by significant wins for the protesters. On the 13th, al-Burhan announced the release of all political prisoners and an end to the curfew imposed by Ibn Auf. On the 14th, the TMC announced steps towards civilian rule, including the selection of a civilian prime minister by the protesters. On the 15th, Dr. Mohammed Nagi al-Sam, one of the most well-known demonstrators, proclaimed that the trust between the protesters and the military was deepening after further conversations. For the first time in a long time, Sudan's future looked bright. And that's the story of how Sudan successfully transitioned to a stable democracy. Thanks for watching. No. Of course it didn't end there. While we'd love to live in the universe where this video can now end, we still have half an hour to go, in which the ambitious two men are going to derail the fledgling democracy and place Sudan on a path towards yet more carnage. And it'll all start at the place where the al-Bashir regime ended, outside the army headquarters. While the talks about the structure of the new government were going on, the protesters were still staging a sit-in outside the army HQ under the banner of the Forces of Freedom and Change, or FFC. By late May, the Professionals Association began ringing alarm bells, warning that the TMC was planning a lethal attack to end the sit-in. On Monday, 3rd of June, the eve of the final day of the holy month of Ramadan, the inevitable happened. Before dawn, the TMC's armed wing, composed of soldiers from the SAF, the RSF, the NISS, and the police, surrounded the sit-in area. The police initially tried to move a barrier, but when the protesters resisted, the soldiers opened fire. Human Rights Watch reported that soldiers assaulted demonstrators, set fire to their tents, and committed unspeakable acts of sexual violence. Reports would later emerge of militia forces dumping bodies in the Nile. Most estimates put the death toll at over 100. Yusra El-Bagir, Africa correspondent at Sky News, captured the shock in Sudan, writing on X, "Everyone feels broken and dejected. You can see it on their faces, on the bus, in the streets. The revolution was stolen from the people. Those in Khartoum aren't just mourning the lives that have been lost, but the loss of a space that became the heart of the revolution." To its credit, the international community tried to intervene. The African Union suspended Sudan's membership while other nations piled on pressure. Before long, the TMC had agreed to a new deal with the FFC, which, remember, is the initialism the protesters were using, to develop a new transitional structure. The key part was the establishment of an 11-member Transitional Sovereignty Council, so many acronyms, or TSC, comprised of 5 civilians chosen by the FFC, 5 military officials selected by the TMC, and 1 civilian mutually agreed upon by both groups. Both al-Burhan and Hemedti secured positions on the council, with al-Burhan as the chair and Hemedti as his deputy. And yes, we know there's a lot of TMCs and TSCs and FFCs to keep in your head. Honestly, don't worry about it too much if you're starting to lose track a little of who is doing what. The important thing is just to keep your eye on what Hemedti and al-Burhan are up to as they skulk around the stage preparing for their big scene. The transition was planned for 39 months, with the military ruling for the first 21 months and the civilians the final 18. The handover was expected to happen in November of 2021, and remember that date because we're going to come back to it in a minute. Under the TSC, Sudan would make significant democratic gains, the rights of the country's Christian minority improved, the press had greater freedom, and al-Bashir's surveillance infrastructure was dismantled. However, this would all come to an end with perhaps the least surprising twist in geopolitical history, the military coup that would make Hemedti and al-Burhan Sudan's undisputed rulers. The state collapses. Now, despite the democratic gains, there was always an undercurrent of tension among the TSC members. At its core was a marriage of convenience built on a bed of distrust with a side piece of barely hidden animosity. A household so dysfunctional that everyone knew that divorce was inevitable. The only question was when. The first attempt to dissolve this awkward partnership and make off with the kids happened in September 2021 when soldiers loyal to al-Bashir attempted a coup. Although the coup attempt failed, no one thought it would be the last. In this, people's intuition was helped by the growing tension in the TSC. The army began to demand changes to the FFC coalition and a reformation of the cabinet. The civilian leadership viewed this as nothing more than a naked power grab. And then came the protests. On the 16th of October, pro-military demonstrators took to the streets chanting, "Down with the hunger government," calling for al-Burhan to seize power. One protester told the AFP that they were protesting because, and we'll quote here, "the current government has failed to bring us justice and equality." Unlike previous demonstrations, protesters got to the gates of the presidential palace with little resistance from the police or other security agents who were conspicuously absent. Despite their relatively small numbers, the demonstrators raised several fair points. Sudan was still in the grip of a ruinous economic crisis that made it difficult for people to afford essentials, and the government had done little to hold the perpetrators of the massacre outside Army HQ accountable. The feeling that Yusra wrote about, that the revolution had been stolen from the people, was palpable throughout much of the country. However, most of Sudan preferred a civilian solution to these challenges. They came out in their hundreds of thousands on the 21st of October to protest against the possibility of military rule. The date was historic because 57 years prior, the Sudanese people had overthrown another military regime and established a constitutional government. Channeling that sense of history, the protesters called on al-Burhan to resign and for the military to hand power over to civilians. One chant was, "This is our country and our government is civilian." The military's response was, "No thank you very much," and it was spelt out with live bullets and tear gas. While the demonstrations were ongoing, Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, the leader of the cabinet, announced that he was speaking to all sides to find a solution to the crisis. But it seemed few sides were listening. On the 25th of October, a mere 6 days before the civilians would take over the TSC, the military arrested 5 senior government figures and announced that they had taken over the government. That same day, al-Burhan announced a state of emergency and the formation of a new technocratic government that would lead Sudan until the next elections in July 2023. This government would include figures from the National Congress Party, a political outfit that had propped up al-Bashir's regime for decades. Al-Burhan would later deny that he had led a coup. He insisted that what he did was necessary to avoid a civil war because the politicians were inciting the public against the military. He portrayed himself as a man with few options who had done what he thought was right for the country. It was a portrayal echoed by Hemedti in an interview with Al Jazeera, where he said, "What happened on October the 25th was the ultimate outcome of a long process. Many discussions were made and many initiatives proposed. We were left with 3 options, the best of which was the move we took, and it was completely agreeable to the Prime Minister himself. We did not make such a move on our own." But while the 2 men could dress it up in fancy words, the fact is that if it walks like a coup, swims like a coup, and seizes power from civilian officials like a coup, then you know the rest, don't you? Come November 2021, there would be no handover of power to civilians. Surprise! Alex DeWall, an analyst whose work we've quoted extensively, believes al-Burhan and Hemedti might have been motivated more by self-interest than any genuine fear of a civil war. Writing for the BBC, he pointed to the fact that both generals wanted al-Bashir tried in Sudan instead of the ICC out of a fear that he would implicate them in alleged war crimes. This placed them at odds with the civilian members of the TSC who preferred an ICC trial. De Waal also believed that the generals feared that an investigation into the Khartoum massacre would hold them accountable for the atrocity. Finally, he argued that the military wanted to protect its vast commercial empire, which included several tax-exempt companies, from civilian oversight. Prime Minister Hamdok had become increasingly critical of the army's entanglement with the economy and their ever-increasing share of the national budget, and the belief was that a fully civilian government would limit this. De Waal's analysis was supported by Oscar Rickett, who, in a piece for Middle East Eye, claimed the generals staged the coup to safeguard their wealth and influence while shielding themselves from international criminal court prosecution. But let's be real, shall we? No one in Sudan needed analysts to tell them a coup had just gone down. And so Sudanese took to the streets once again in another doomed bid to stop things from going horribly wrong. Look, by now, you could probably guess how the security forces responded they started singing Kumbaya and holding hands with the protesters, didn't they? Well, no, of course they didn't. They launched an all-out campaign of violence, which is a bit different. The African Union, which had reinstated Sudan, once again suspended its membership. The US, EU, IMF, and World Bank froze millions of dollars earmarked for aid. The coup was also unpopular among traditional international partners, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Russia. The International Crisis Group described a sense of surprise in Khartoum to the fierceness of the resistance both at home and internationally. Hemedti, sensing that the tide was turning against the military, began distancing himself from al-Burhan. Their relationship was already strained after the appointment of al-Bashir-era officials to important posts, suggesting to Hemedti that al-Burhan sought to entrench the supremacy of Khartoum's traditional ruling class, the same elites that had long looked down on the tribes Hemedti was proudly a part of. The aid freeze left Sudan in dire straits. The economy could barely even be said to be shambling along, and the people could feel it when they looked at their empty wallets and felt the hunger in their bellies. Hemedti tried to align himself with the public, going as far as presenting himself as a reformer and negotiating with the protest leaders. This caused the rift between the two generals to grow wider, transforming from a ford into something the size of the Grand Canyon. Hemedti was counting on one key fact, that regardless of how much the protesters distrusted the RSF, many of them viewed the army as their historical enemy. A feeling that had only grown stronger after the appointment of al-Bashir-era loyalists. And this would come to be the defining feature of Sudan's final months of peace, a constantly widening rift between two men with the ego and military forces to believe that they might one day become the sole ruler of the country. There was the signing of a December 2022 framework aimed at restoring Sudan to civilian rule. Hemedti championed the deal because of clauses he believed would give him autonomy from al-Burhan and the army. One of these clauses recognized the RSF as a regular entity affiliated with the armed forces, but under the direct command of a civilian head of state rather than the army chief. Conversely, al-Burhan only signed the deal because of significant external pressure, feeling that it unfairly benefited Hemedti. Then there was the spike in tensions in February and early March 2023 after an intense competition between the RSF and SAF to recruit new talent throughout Sudan, particularly in Hemedti's stronghold of Darfur. At the same time, rumors began to spread that the SAF was courting Musa Hilal, former leader of the Janjaweed and Hemedti's longtime rival, as a way to make inroads into Hemedti's Rizkat ethnic group and weaken his base of support. Hemedti responded to the SAF's provocation by initiating a rapid military build-up in Khartoum, which the SAF matched, until a March 11th agreement between the generals which led to de-escalation. Hemedti withdrew his forces from Greater Khartoum, and the generals agreed to form a new Joint Security Committee. Sudan allowed itself a moment of calm, clearly thinking that it had dodged a civil war. Unfortunately, since you're watching a channel called WarFronts and not Peace Fronts, you can probably guess what happened next, can't you? That's right, both sides started sliding right back towards conflict. The catalyst? Negotiations to finally form a civilian government. The dam bursts. Now at this point, some of you may be wondering why this wasn't all over the news in the spring of 2023. So obvious does it seem in retrospect that Hemedti and al-Burhan were gearing up for a military showdown. Honestly, we don't have an answer to that. Maybe the wider world was too distracted by the war in Ukraine. Maybe the feel-good vibes of the 2019 revolution were still so fresh that journalists preferred to believe some solution, or any solution, would be found. But The fact is that cracks were obvious the moment talks began. For much of the negotiations, it was the civilians on one side and the military as a single entity on the other. However, one thorny issue, security sector reform, pitted Hemedti against al-Burhan. The two generals specifically disagreed on the timetable for integrating the RSF into the army and how this combined force would be led. Hemedti and his civilian allies favoured a 10-year integration timeline, while the SAF wanted integration to happen in 2 years, for the obvious reason that al-Burhan didn't want to give Hemedti time to entrench his power base. As frustrations mounted on both sides, Hemedti accused al-Burhan of breaking his word because of pressure from other SAF generals. Across Sudan, an uneasy silence settled in. The SAF and RSF were gathering men and machines, and any fool could see what was about to happen. On the 13th of April, RSF soldiers deployed near an airbase in the town of Miro. The SAF responded by accusing the RSF of unauthorized movements and giving them an ultimatum to stand down. To cut a really long, depressing story short, the RSF refused. And so we return to the date that the history books will record as the start of the latest iteration of the Sudan Civil War, the 15th of April 2023. For a few horrible days, the world was rapt, watching as violence engulfed Sudan, watching as fighter jets bombed Khartoum, a city that had survived most of Sudan's previous conflicts unscathed, watching as government buildings went up in flames, as foreign powers evacuated their citizens, and as the third great war of the 2020s, after Tigray and Ukraine, finally got underway. Because both sides had troops throughout the country, fighting broke out everywhere, almost all at once, with Khartoum and Darfur being hardest hit. Khartoum in particular suffered heavily because sustained urban warfare in the city before this was unprecedented. And now the two generals were shelling university campuses, besieging hospitals, and bombing government buildings. The SAF's army headquarters were encircled, and al-Burhan himself was trapped inside for 3 months before escaping to Port Sudan, far away on the Red Sea coast. Reports differ on how al-Burhan escaped Khartoum. The RSF claims that they let him leave after an international agreement was reached, a claim repeated by members of the FFC. Al-Burhan denies these claims. He alleged that he was rescued in a daring military operation that included naval and air forces and resulted in the death of 2 SAF soldiers, and probably including him posing shirtless atop a helicopter as it flew off into the sunset. We'll let you decide which version of the story you believe. Now, while a handful of army bases in Khartoum were falling to the RSF, the paramilitaries were likewise running unchecked across Darfur. That summer, they seized the city of El Janina, ushering in one of the first great atrocities of a war that would soon be defined by them. According to videos reviewed by the Sudan War Monitor, a Substack outlet tracking the war in Sudan, civilians were rounded up based on their ethnicity and whipped, with the primary victims being those of the Masalit tribe. Reports would later emerge of a massacre in the Janina neighborhood of Ardamata, where, according to Le Monde, at least 10,000 people died. By autumn, SAF morale in the region had crumbled, shaken by multiple defeats and acute shortages due to RSF-imposed sieges. In these months, the paramilitaries managed to capture Niala, Sudan's fourth largest city and home to the SAF's 16th Infantry Division headquarters, and Zalinge, the capital of central Darfur, and home to another SAF infantry division. When the latter heard that the RSF was on their way, they fled, letting the paramilitaries take the city without firing a single shot. We've made a huge deal about psychological blows throughout this piece. This is why. When wielded effectively, fear can be a much more potent weapon than actual weapons. Now, we focused on these incidents to demonstrate a couple of things. One, the very real likelihood in this period that the SAF would be defeated on the battlefield. And two, the sheer brutality of the fighting. Although war is always hell for civilians, Sudan's factions seem to go out of their way to punish bystanders. Prior to the RSF massacre, the SAF shelled ethnically Arab neighborhoods in El Janina, killing hundreds. Yet even the army couldn't compare to the paramilitaries, where al-Burhan's goons might fire in civilian areas without a care. The RSF would conduct door-to-door massacres based on ethnicity. Where the military might summarily execute those suspected of collaboration, the RSF would carry out the mass and enslavement of women and girls. Among their known victims, detailed this year in a harrowing UN report, have been children as young as 1 year old. If there's any other sentence more perfectly calibrated to make you lose your faith in humanity, well, we've yet to hear it. Antony Blinken, former US Secretary of State, described the RSF's actions as genocide. In a statement toward the end of his time in office, he said, "The RSF and allied militias have systematically murdered men and boys, even infants, on an ethnic basis, and deliberately targeted women and girls from certain ethnic groups for and other forms of brutal sexual violence. Based on this information, I have now concluded that members of the RSF and allied militias have committed genocide in Sudan." End quote. To be clear, this does not make the SAF angels. The military has been accused by Amnesty International and other global organizations of war crimes. Aside from shelling civilians, they also blockaded entire regions, triggering levels of hunger on par with the Ethiopian famine of the 1980s. But whether or not the SAF are angels, it's certainly true that the RSF really are devils on horseback. When the bullets fly, human rights take a back seat. And few modern conflicts would see so many bullets fly or so many human rights abuses as the nightmare unfolding in Sudan. Alliances bring the war to the periphery. Now, at the start of the conflict, it was clear to both the RSF and the SAF leadership that neither side could win on their own. This became especially apparent to the SAF when al-Burhan was trapped in Khartoum and couldn't effectively command his troops. It was crucial to find allies and do it fast. Both groups turned to rebel movements that had fought against Khartoum, trying to present themselves as the better alternative. The most notable of these was the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North, SPLMN. Active in the Blue Nile and Kordofan states, SPLM is an armed group composed of former members of the SPLA who had been left in Sudan following the independence of South Sudan. One would have to do a whole video on South Sudan to unpack precisely what this means. The Crib Notes version is that they hated al-Bashir and fought his forces constantly. In 2017, the group split in two. One faction was led by Abdulaziz al-Hilu and the other by Malik Agar. That split would resurface, shaping who each leader decided to ally with. Malik Agar chose to ally with al-Burhan, who rewarded him with the role of deputy head of the TSC, a position previously held by Hemedti. In this role, he would act as de facto head of government, while al-Burhan was trapped in Khartoum. Abdulaziz, on the other hand, threw his lot in with Hemedti. Regional observers feared that involving the SPLMN factions risked dragging the South into the war. Their worst fears were realized when, in June 2023, SPLMN al-Hilu began attacking and capturing undermanned and abandoned SAF garrisons in South Kordofan state. By June, they were attacking SAF compounds in the state capital, Kadugli. From August to September, they laid siege to the city, killing hundreds and forcing thousands to flee. Before the war, South Kordofan, one of Sudan's poorest states, was already experiencing food insecurity. The fighting only made it worse. It was a reality that would be replicated throughout all of Sudan. Wherever the war spread, it seemed to overwhelmingly bring one of the four horsemen in its wake. In this case, the skin and bone man, known as famine. So yes, it's time to turn our attention to one of the greatest horrors of Sudan's war. As of autumn of 2025, hunger in the country has reached catastrophic levels, with famine confirmed in 10 areas and 17 more at risk. In some areas, the World Food Programme is all that stands between the people and starvation. Here's how the WFP describes the situation, quote, "Sudan risks becoming the world's largest hunger crisis in recent history as conflict continues to rage, destroying livelihoods, infrastructure, trade routes, and supply chains. A protracted famine is taking hold. The only place in the world at this level of hunger, and without humanitarian assistance, hundreds of thousands could die." The cause of this growing humanitarian crisis? Armed groups restricting access to aid for entire regions held by their opponents, a tactic that was already taking root in 2023. And as the war grew in intensity, so too did the number of armed factions. Before long, Hemedti would count among his allies the Sudan Liberation Movement Transitional Council, the Sudan Liberation Gathering, and the Third Front. Al-Burhan, on the other hand, wound up relying on Islamist groups such as the al-Burhan Ibn Malik Brigade, the Islamist Movement, and the Sudanese Popular Resistance Factions, or PRF. Beyond the Islamists, however, al-Burhan also secured crucial support from Darfuri ethnic militias who, fed up with the RSF genociding their people, threw their weight behind the SAF. The alliances seem to have paid off to a varying degree. For al-Burhan, he secured critical help in retaking the capital, a spectacular campaign that began in September of 2024 and culminated with the SAF marching triumphant through Khartoum's ruined streets some 8 months later. Meanwhile, Hemedti's allies have further boosted the legitimacy of the parallel government the RSF declared in the summer of 2025. However, they both have challenges that we can't ignore. Several experts believe that al-Burhan's alliance with the Islamists is one of convenience and not conviction. Therefore, the two sides could very well be the belligerents in the next phase of this never-ending war. For Hemedti, the question is simpler. Will his alliance hold in the wake of increasing SAF victories? It's an important question to ask, especially in light of reports that soldiers who defected from the RSF were instrumental in the SAF's drive to Khartoum. Unfortunately, our powers of precognition are what we wish they were, so we can't say where these alliances are heading. And while this channel has made some pretty accurate predictions in the past, including the 2023 takeover of Nagorno-Karabakh and the restarting of the Syrian civil war in late 2024, we're also far from 100% accurate. I mean, show me an analyst who is always right, and I'll show you an expert bullshitter. What we can say with confidence, given the benefit of history, is that alliances in Sudan last only as long as they need to. Once they outlive their usefulness, they are discarded, and often violently. And speaking of violent alliances, now seems like the perfect time to discuss the other major factor in Sudan's war, the web of outside actors all conspiring to make the fighting 1,000 times worse. The region intervenes, and the war spills over. When Crisis Group reported on the start of the civil war, they urged regional players, including Chad, Ethiopia, and Egypt, not to get involved with either side of the conflict, but rather push for peace. You could probably guess how that went. According to Dr. John Mabaku, a professor at Weber State University, more than 10 countries across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia have been drawn into the Sudan war, turning it into a gigantic proxy conflict. While most countries deny their involvement, each of them has a strategic interest in Sudan. Ethiopia, for example, has leaned towards supporting the RSF, in part because of their shared ties with the UAE, one of the paramilitary's key backers. Conversely, opposition groups hostile to Addis Ababa have looked more favorably on the SAF, seeing them as a counterweight to the RSF-UAE-Ethiopia alignment. Despite this, Giorgio Musso, a researcher at Roma Tre University, argues there is little immediate risk of Sudan's war spilling over into Ethiopia. The SAF would be unwilling to push its allies into a proxy war because it would incur the wrath of Addis Ababa. A military reprisal from Ethiopia would open up a new front for the SAF, spreading its forces too thin. For Egypt, the war demands a delicate approach. Officially, Cairo is neutral. However, it has long-standing ties with the SAF, which it views as the institutional backbone of Sudan and a stabilizing force against the RSF. Egypt and the SAF have such deep ties that, according to analyst Khulud Kher, Egypt was influencing key military decisions. Additionally, the Wall Street Journal reported that Egypt was supplying the SAF with Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drones and training them on how to use them. Egypt's western neighbor Libya has also been sucked into this war. Khalifa Haftar, arguably the most powerful man in Libya today, has close personal ties with Hemedti. However, Sami Hamdi, editor-in-chief of the geopolitics-focused outlet International Interest, believes that it is their shared ties to the UAE more than any personal relationship that underpins the partnership between Libya and the RSF. Quoting him here, as firm allies of the UAE and as key moving parts of UAE foreign policy, a network has been facilitated in which Haftar has helped train Hemedti's forces, using soldiers from Hemedti to bolster his position in Libya, and established and benefited from illicit trade routes that have been facilitated by Hemedti. End quote. Apart from the military support, Libya has been an instrumental part of RSF's fuel supply chain. S&P Global, a leading supplier of data and analytics, alleges that Libya regularly imports Russian oil through Turkish middlemen before it is smuggled out of the country's porous borders into Sudan for the RSF. The RSF either uses this oil for its own needs or resells it, generating billions of dollars in profit to fuel the war. This money has been essential for the RSF, as it has allowed it to hire an army of mercenaries from all over the world. We already mentioned the Colombian mercenaries back in Chapter 1, roughly 1,000 hours ago, but they aren't the only ones. Closer to home, according to Al Jazeera, the RSF has hired fighters from Chad, the Central African Republic, Libya, and Niger, paying them around $1,650 to $3,300 for 6 months of service. That's a hell of an amount of money in a region where large swaths of the population live on less than $2 a day. While some of these fighters are undoubtedly motivated by money, there are those who are driven by ethnic ties to Hemedti and the rest of the RSF. These ties extend beyond borders and have given Hemedti ready-made pools of fighting-age men to pull from. And then there's the UAE, which, while maintaining official neutrality, has emerged as the RSF's most significant supporter. The UAE's involvement in the war appears driven by both economic interests and political strategy. On the economic front, Sudanese researcher Hamed Khalafala told The Guardian that the UAE is interested in natural resources that it lacks, including arable land and minerals like gold. Hemedti still controls a large swath of Sudan's gold mines, making him a valuable ally for the UAE. On the political front, Federico Donelli, a professor of international relations at Italy's University of Trieste, told The Guardian that the UAE is supporting the RSF to counter Saudi influence in Sudan and prevent the spread of political Islam, which it sees as a threat to its security. And we can't speak about political Islam without talking about Iran, a nation that has been the poster boy for political Islam since the 1979 revolution. Iran and Sudan have a complicated relationship. For nearly 30 years, they enjoyed close ties, with Sudan even being Iran's closest ally in Africa. However, in 2014, because of fears that growing Iranian influence threatened the Sunni majority, Sudan expelled Iranian diplomats and officially cut off relations with Tehran 2 years later. The Sudan war would bring these old allies back together. According to Reuters, by late 2023, an Iranian cargo plane made 6 trips from Iran to Port Sudan. While Reuters couldn't confirm the cargo, the RSF alleged that the army was receiving deliveries of Iranian drones, such as the Mahajir 4, Mahajir 6, and Ababil. Soon after, drones were spotted over the skies of Sudan, and analysts credit their surveillance and strike capabilities with helping the SAF repel RSF advances and retake key sites. For an army that has been badly outmaneuvered in the war's early months, Iranian hardware provided a much-needed technological equalizer. Apart from the weapon shipments, observers say Iran has helped the SAF recruit and train new soldiers. Now, Tehran wasn't doing any of this out of a sense of altruism. In fact, it was the opposite. It was a sense of pure self-interest. According to the African Defense Forum, establishing a presence in Sudan is crucial for Iran because it would allow it to box in regional opponents, including Saudi Arabia and Israel, and threaten shipping through the Suez Canal. Regional analyst Abdal Manim Himmat wrote that, quote, Iran considers Sudan a starting point towards achieving long-term strategic gains in terms of expansion in Africa, control of the Red Sea, and wider regional influence. By allying with the SAF, Tehran gets to undercut the UAE and reassert itself in a country that it lost to Gulf influence years ago. Then there's Iran's longtime ally Russia, whose allegiances in the war have seesawed back and forth depending on who appears to be winning. Initially, Moscow, through the Wagner Group, threw its weight behind Hemedti. Wagner had been active in Sudan since the days of al-Bashir, and when the dictator was ousted, Prigozhin tried to align himself with al-Burhan. When this failed, he allied himself with Hemedti. According to Samuel Ramadi, author of the book Russia and Africa, the partnership was primarily aimed at creating a smuggling route for Sudanese gold so that the proceeds could fund Wagner Group operations inside Ukraine. The gold smuggling operation also provided much-needed revenue for the RSF. However, after Prigozhin's death and the absorption of the Wagner Group into the broader Russian forces, the Kremlin began to value Sudan more for its coastline than its gold mines. For years, Moscow has tried to establish a naval presence in the Horn of Africa, specifically Port Sudan. Natalia Shamalashvili, a researcher at the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies, believes that control over this port would allow Russia to monitor key ocean trade routes, counter the influence of Western nations and their Gulf allies, and if necessary, disrupt Red Sea traffic. Samashvili further argues that compared to Russia's naval base in Syria, where operational difficulties persist, to put it mildly, Port Sudan provides a safer and more strategically located option for extending influence into Africa and the Middle East. Beyond its military value, the facility could serve as an intelligence center, strengthening Moscow's capacity to track regional trade and defense movement. So when the SAF agreed to give Moscow the port in early 2025 in exchange for military aid, it was almost a no-brainer for the Kremlin to abandon the RSF for the SAF. Chad has also claimed neutrality in the conflict. However, the SAF accused it of being a transit hub for weapons from the UAE to the RSF. Although Chad denied these allegations, media outlets and the UN independently confirmed that the weapons were headed to the RSF from the UAE. The UAE had constructed a hospital in eastern Chad, ostensibly to provide free medical services to Chadian people and Sudanese refugees. But in reality, it was used for military activities and to smuggle weapons. Speaking of refugees, Chad is dealing with the reality of having a close neighbor in a state of outright collapse. The UN estimates that over 1 million refugees have fled to Chad since the beginning of the war. According to Charles Bussell, an analyst at Crisis Group, this influx has placed immense strain on Chad's isolated and already impoverished eastern provinces, particularly Uday, whose population increased by 60% in 2 years. The surge in population has driven up demand for housing and staples such as cooking oil, with disputes occasionally flaring up between the locals and the newcomers. Another country dealing with the spillover of this war is South Sudan. The South Sudanese government is heavily reliant on oil for revenue, and since it's a landlocked country, it depends entirely on a pipeline passing through Sudan to get the oil to the sea. So, you can imagine the panic in Juba when this pipeline broke in the middle of the war. Overnight, Juba lost its only oil export route, and the country was starved of fuel for transport, electricity, and basic services. While the pipeline would eventually be fixed, it exposed not just how reliant South Sudan was on Khartoum, but also just how fragile South Sudan's own peace was. South Sudan, you remember, is a country that has been in a state of conflict almost since independence in 2011. At times, that has meant shocking but low-level violence in the countryside. At others, it has meant full-blown civil war, including a period of conflict from 2013 to 2018 in which 400,000 people died. Ending without a definitive victory for any faction, the peace since then has relied on President Salva Kiir being able to line the pockets of the elites with oil money, a plan the burst pipeline took a hatchet to. And then there's been the impact on the border. The fighting has caused more than 1 million people to cross to South Sudan, placing immense strain on an already fragile nation. And it's not just refugees moving across the border. RSF fighters have crossed into Upper Nile State multiple times, particularly around the border town of Rek. According to the Sudan War Monitor Substack, the South Sudanese army allows them in since the RSF are willing to fight ethnic Nuer militias that are loyal to former Vice President Riek Machar, currently on trial for treason. The government and the paramilitaries also trade weapons for fuel, while President Kiir's own growing closeness with UAE would suggest Abu Dhabi might be forcing them into a marriage of convenience. It's likely no coincidence that UAE has since built a so-called field hospital in South Sudan that looks really rather similar to the one in Chad that it's used for weapons transfers. The danger doesn't stop in South Sudan. Fighting has spilled into border zones with Egypt and Libya, creating a deep sense of dread among analysts that the conflict could soon engulf the whole region. If the war continues on its current trajectory, it risks destabilizing the entire Horn of Africa, which would have disastrous consequences for the rest of the world. Quoting regional analyst Shuit Wald-Michael, with foreign powers getting drawn further into Sudan amid a complex mesh of alliances, the risks that the war's shockwaves will carry across the Red Sea region are heightening. What comes next? We'd like to tell you that what comes next for Sudan is peace. But again, we don't have a crystal ball, and if we did, we doubt that peace is what we would see inside it. What it would likely show is that more than half of the country's population, about 25 million people, need humanitarian assistance. Hunger has reached catastrophic levels, with famine confirmed in 10 areas and 17 more at risk. In some areas, the World Food Programme is all that stands between those people and starvation. The health and education systems have collapsed. The economy is barely hanging on. Sudan's finance minister reported that the war had resulted in economic losses exceeding $26 billion, a massive sum considering that in 2021, Sudan's GDP was $34 billion. Over 4 million people lost their jobs, and 7 million were pushed into extreme poverty. Despite this, the war doesn't seem to have a clear end in sight. Peace deals and ceasefires have come and gone with such alarming frequency that Al Jazeera had an entire article dedicated to why they keep failing. The biggest takeaway? Neither al-Burhan nor Hemedti is interested in a peace deal. The reason? Both still believe that a military victory is possible. For al-Burhan, that belief comes from the events of the last 13 months. For the first year and a half of war, the story was all about how an RSF victory seemed inevitable. Across 2023 and into 2024, the paramilitaries not only seized most of Khartoum and Darfur, but swept into the agricultural states that supply the capital, secured most of the southern border, and seemed to be preparing to march eastward to Port Sudan. By last summer, as most of the world was consumed with US election fever, al-Burhan's own generals were briefing that he might have to step down. So certain did the SAF's defeat seem. But then came September of 2024 and the start of one of the great counterattacks in military history. That month saw the SAF, now replete with Iranian weapons, launch a counteroffensive across the country. From initially capturing key bridges in Khartoum, it snowballed into a string of successes that lasted into late spring. Key strategic cities like Wad Madani and Khartoum Bari fell, followed by the capital itself. Since then, the army has driven west into Kordofan. For Hemedti, his belief in victory comes from the RSF's growing stranglehold on Darfur. While the days when it looks like the RSF might become Sudan's sole rulers are definitively over, it's increasingly looking like the paramilitaries may be able to petition the nation. The end of August saw the group swear in a parallel government in South Darfur, in the capital of Niala, and Hemedti is hardly short of international backers who might make recognizing his rule the price for peace. Hence, the SAF's drive west. If al-Burhan is going to have any chance of keeping Sudan from splitting in two for the second time in 15 years, his army is going to have to regain some territory in Darfur as soon as possible. Honestly, though, it seems unlikely that either side is strong enough to claim a military victory, and that means Sudan's only hope for peace in the foreseeable future is for the external actors intervening in the war to put their own interests aside and force the two generals to the table. To be frank, this is about as likely as me being crowned the next Queen of Denmark. I can hope. So Sudan keeps marching toward the abyss of petition. So where does that leave the Sudanese people? Well, desperate, but not broken. Speaking to the World Food Programme, renowned human rights activist Awadia Mahmoud believes that peace is possible. Quote, "Our hope is for the war to stop so we can go back home. We don't want war. It harmed us, particularly women." Many echo these sentiments, including Fatima, a mother of 7. She hopes that in the future, classrooms can be used for learning instead of surviving, and that her children and all of Sudan's children can thrive instead of constantly having to run away from violence. Quoting her, "They are taking everything away from us. They need to sit down, speak, and solve this." Sadly, though, as this video has shown, such an outcome remains, for now, nothing more than a bitter dream. Away from the headlines, Sudan's conflict seems destined to march on, a never-ending tale of fire and bloodshed in which each new chapter only brings some new level of suffering. And making videos for this channel, we often find ourselves encountering the worst humanity has to offer. The generals who bombard civilians trying to flee, the politicians who send young men into a meat grinder to fight their wars, the evil minds that plot destruction, and the suffering that follows from it. And yet, in spite of this, rarely have we ever encountered a war as apocalyptic and as inhumane as the one tearing Sudan apart, a war that plumbs new depths of depravity, even as the wider world seems to react with little more than a shrug. Peace will one day return to Africa's third largest nation, but for now, this war remains the great, underreported crisis of our lifetimes, a daily reminder of the evil that men are capable of. The very least we can do is try and acknowledge what's happening. Thank you for watching, and if you'd like to see more of this long-form content, please consider subscribing to Fronts.co. Videos like this, pretty expensive and time-consuming to make, and it's your support that allows us to do this longer in-depth content. A subscription is just $5 a month, and in return, you get 2 exclusive videos a week, and the knowledge that your backing is allowing us to produce videos on underreported but important conflicts like the one in Sudan. Again, that's Fronts.co. Check it out if you'd like to support us. And no worries if you don't. I'll see you next time.